during the COVID pandemic. And we also want to get ideas and proposals for what Coalition can do to shape the narrative around encryption at the Five Eyes annual meeting this year, keeping in mind that it could very well be virtual. So let me tell you a little bit about how we're going to do this today. We want there to be plenty of time for your questions and for interaction amongst the different panelists, who I'm going to introduce in a bit. Feel free to ask questions throughout. If you want to, do take advantage of the Q&A functionality, which is located in the bar directly below the video on your screen. And when you submit a question, a Coalition member staff will take your question and pass them on. But if we don't get to yours for some reason, we're very happy to continue the conversation afterwards. This is just the beginning. Let me take you through the agenda quickly so you know where we are, what we're doing. There are 3 parts to our session. Before we begin, I'll set the scene very briefly with an intro to the Five Eyes. Then in the first half, the speakers are going to be looking back and also at the present, considering what's going on in the Five Eyes countries when it comes to encryption. What's the current narrative, particularly in the countries where they're from? Has anything changed? Or do they think anything's going to change because of the COVID pandemic? We're going to close this part with Q&A so that we can hear from you all. Then in the second half, we'll be looking at the future to what we could do as a coalition, building on previous advocacy efforts. And I'm excited to hear from you all what you think we can do. The panelists are going to offer some perspectives here, and we'll have Q&A for this segment as well. And the aim is obviously to lay some groundwork for some coordinated advocacy efforts around this important forum. And then we'll end with brief closing remarks from the panelists. So let me introduce those panelists to you. Very excited to have them here. We have Matt Hatfield, who is Campaigns Director at Open Media, which is a North American-based grassroots civil society organization that works to keep the internet open, accessible, and surveillance-free. Matt, feel free to add to that if you wish when you come on. We're also joined by Andi Thompson, who's a Senior Policy Analyst at New America's Open Technology Initiative. Andi, do feel free to say a bit more about OTI when you come on as well. And last but not least, we're joined by Joe Cannataci, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. He was appointed to that role in July 2015, and he's also the head of the Department of Information Policy and Governance at the Faculty of Media and Knowledge Sciences of the University of Malta. That is a very long title, Joe, but hopefully I got it right. So I'm delighted to be joined by these experts and looking forward to hearing from them and from all of you in a bit. Hearing that you're having a little bit of cutting out. Okay, but I'm going to keep going for now. Hoping some of you at least can hear me. We're going to look quickly at the Five Eyes before I hand over to our speakers. So the Five Eyes is really the world's oldest intelligence partnership, set up shortly after World War II. It spans 5 Anglophone countries: New Zealand, Australia, the US, UK, and Canada. Their annual meeting brings together attorney generals, interior ministers, who meet very much in closed and secretive quarters, at least for their deliberations. But in recent years, they have been a bit more open, a bit more public-facing, let's say, with their joint communiques after annual meetings, shedding light on their positions on key issues. And for the last few years, since 2017 in particular, the Five Eyes have been public about their stance on encryption, calling for it to be weakened to fight crimes like child sex abuse and terrorism, and in their words, to protect public safety. For example, the joint communique from the 2017 meeting stated that they were committed to exploring shared solutions to the perceived impediment posed by encryption to investigative objectives. So if you remember, this was a time when the backlash against encryption had received new impetus following the Apple FBI case in 2016. There has been a lot of advocacy around this by civil society and technologists. In 2017, almost 100 NGOs signed a joint letter to the Five Eyes demanding a rejection of laws, policies, and other mandates or practices that limit access to or undermine encryption. But the Five Eyes have continued to release these statements. And in 2018 and 2019, they they released similar statements. So in 2018, they released a statement of principles on access to evidence and encryption, stating, should governments continue to encounter impediments to lawful access, we may pursue technological enforcement, legislative, or other measures to achieve lawful access solutions. In 2019, they said tech companies should include mechanisms in the design of their encrypted products and services. I'm glad to hear that the video, well, the audio is better, but the video is not great. Sorry about that. I hope we can get it fixed. But yeah, so as I was saying, there's been a consistent narrative around encryption from the Five Eyes in recent years. And in 2019, tech companies, they said tech companies should include mechanisms in the design of their encrypted products and services to allow governments to obtain access to data in a readable and usable format. So simply put, these are calling for backdoors to be built into devices by companies and from these powerful countries in the Western world. And at the 2019 meeting, ministers agreed with members of the tech industry who took part in a roundtable with ministers there to collaborate on a set of voluntary principles to combat child sex abuse. And earlier in the year, so earlier this year, in March, those principles were released. They don't directly reference encryption and are designed to be flexible. But at the press conference launching the principles, the acting US Homeland Security Secretary in the US said that encryption, like any tool, can be abused. And a minister with the UK's Home Office, meanwhile, called encryption the elephant in the room. So it's clearly still very much part of that narrative. And actually on that, the coalition has, since it's been launched, so very recently today, been contacted by the Home Office to discuss this issue. So it looks like we already have an opening there, and the coalition is already having some impact. So it'd be great to hear from you about how we can leverage that, and I'm looking forward to discussing that in more detail in the second part of this discussion. But in 2020 as well, of course, we have seen the outbreak of COVID-19, a situation that's profoundly changed all of our lives and moved many more of our activities online, making us more reliant on digital technologies than ever before. We're also seeing more cybercrime online, from phishing, malware, to more serious crimes. I was on the webinar earlier focusing on Europe, where the European Commission rep was talking about the fact that Europol is seeing an increasing amount of child sex abuse material and grooming as a result or since the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. And these are real challenges, of course. So I suppose one of the questions we can discuss here is can we have a nuanced discussion about this within the Five Eyes? Because so far, the narrative has really been, to put it crudely, encryption's bad, and it needs to be weakened. So I hope that framing has been helpful to set the scene a bit for our discussion today. I'm going to turn to Matt now with a couple of questions. Matt, hopefully you can hear me, but I gave a brief recap there, and it would be great if you could reflect on the narrative so far, what you think are the key issues and problems with how encryption has been discussed within the Five Eyes, and whether or not you think that's going to change, perhaps reflecting on Canada's role within the partnership, and perhaps, thinking about those voluntary principles and working with this global alliance, which the Five Eyes have said they will work with, that composes other stakeholders. Is this an opportunity to have a more nuanced debate and discussion about encryption? What do you think?
There's a lot of different questions there, and I'll see what I can do on a few of them. So thanks a lot, Sheetal. And as you said, I'm here from Open Media. We're a grassroots group who campaigns primarily in Canada and the US. Since 2017, we've also done some campaigning in other Five Eyes countries, as it became clear that encryption was being attacked in concert by governments in each of them. But our primary experience is in North America. So if I misrepresent the state of affairs in any of the other three, and you in the audience know better, please feel free to correct my mistake. Before moving further, I want to pick up on your point about the increase in cybercrime, and I find that a very interesting point for governments to be making a lot of, because if you'll forgive me for using a sort of a Canada relevant metaphor, to me, the suggestion that weakening encryption is a way of protecting me from the bad guys, it feels a little bit like telling me I should set my house on fire in order to stay warm from the flurries of snow outside. What I mean by this is that encrypted communications is quietly preventing far, far more criminal activity than it's facilitating. The vast majority of crime enabled by the internet today is financial, involving stolen identities, cracked accounts, and scams that defraud users. And encrypted, authenticated private communications with everyone, from financial institutions to our family, is the best and only real defense against that. To quickly remind everyone of sort of the legal situation in the Five Eyes at this point, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK all have bills that, in one way or another, require companies to decrypt on command. Some are stronger than others. I think New Zealand has the earliest and the weakest one. The UK's Investigatory Powers Act is very wide-ranging, and Australia has the most recent 2018 amendment to their Telecommunications Act that kind of tries to play it both ways and has backdoors, but only targeted, only for specific users, not universal in theory. Here in North America, in the US, to my knowledge, there's no law right now on the books that attacks encryption. But the Earn It Act that was introduced by the US Senate this year is trying to make encryption out of bounds without using the name. I think Andi will probably touch on that in more detail. And in Canada, we don't have any law on encryption, either for or against. But historically, we've been a huge champion of encryption. So from 1998 to 2018, it was really a formal matter of Canada's governmental policy to defend encryption. And that was a really very alarming change for us around 2019, where they joined the Five Eyes communique that asked tech companies to include backdoors. We haven't seen that before from our government. And to be honest, they've been pretty quiet about it since. Although our suspicion is that they're just hoping that it will become an international norm that they can just kind of accede to. But they're not doing what they've done in the past, which is be a real major international roadblock to attacks on encryption. In terms of where we think people are, as a grassroots group, our focus is always sort of what is the public discourse around this, and how can we strengthen it. In terms of where we think people are and how we think COVID-19 is affecting that. Basically, for over 20 years, we've seen that when people in the Five Eyes countries are asked about encryption and about whether they want their online communications to be accessible to government, people say no. There's some exceptions you can produce, either by really twisting the question, or I think the UK of all countries seems to be most open to it. But most of the time, on most polls, people really, really want to have secure communications online. And we've really seen that in our petition on the Five Eyes, to the Five Eyes in defense of strong encryption, which was promoted in all 5 countries, and which we got over 50,000 signatories to, making it one of our most successful in the last few years. People know that strong encryption is the only way of having actual safe encryption. I think the duration of the debate has helped that filter into public consciousness. And people see why strong encryption matters. They look around, they read the news, they see that governments aren't able to keep control of their own tools and exploits. If the NSA can't hold on to their own tools and lose control of them like they did a couple of years ago, really, what are the odds that our local law enforcement are going to do any better? So I think prior to COVID-19, there was a fairly widespread public understanding, although certainly not universal, of why we're having this fight. In terms of how COVID-19 is changing that, in the short term, we've definitely seen some changes in the conversation around rights and privacy. So around cell phone contact tracing, for example, which, to be clear, has some very serious open questions around whether it's an effective tool to the task. But we've heard from a significant portion of our community that they're willing to entertain that idea if it can be done while minimizing harm to privacy and rights. And as a result, in our work, we've been working with civil society groups and experts on building some strong privacy defending principles for what an app like that could look like. And we've heard some positive things from the Canadian government about them being open to adopting those principles. With encryption, though, I don't think it falls into the same box as most privacy issues, where I don't know, I can't think of any plausible reason that weakening encryption would help the fight against COVID-19. I don't know if anyone else here can. I'd be interested to know. And at the same time, so many more people are living their entire lives online right now for work, for education, for access to information, for maintaining interpersonal relationships. That might not feel like a huge change if you're sort of an extremely online person already. But for the average person, I think the pandemic has massively accelerated both the pace of digital life taking over our real life and the way that takeover has become more obvious and visible. My theory about how we're going to exit this, I don't know. But I think as people are habituated to doing every part of their lives online, they're going to have a much, much better sense of just how much is stored about them in online spaces. I think, I just said that a lot of people had an intellectual understanding of why strong encryption mattered before. I see us coming out of this with a much more visceral feel for just how many data points there are about us online and how much of our life is there. And I think that has a huge impact on what's politically possible and what feels salient. So, politics works off the gut. It's not an intellectual thing. And I think it will be much easier for us to have a fight on strong encryption in the future and harder for the Five Eyes governments to argue that it only matters for terrorists and abusers. I have a really important asterisk to that, though, that we need to get the narrative right on this. So trust in government and belief in giving government power is going up a lot in many of the countries affected by the pandemic. And we need to be very careful that we're clear that you can't hand just one set of keys only to the government. I know it's a perennial point on encryption, but we need to really hammer that one home. And otherwise, there's a risk that they could have a carte blanche for breaking encryption and anything else they want to do after this. So we really got to repeat that one till we're blue in the face. That's sort of my overview.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was great. You gave us a lot of answers actually to those questions that I posed to you, and also succinctly as well. So thank you for that. So you mentioned that in the Five Eyes countries, it depends on which country we're talking about, whether or not there's legislation that currently requires companies to decrypt on demand. And that's the case in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, but not in the US and Canada at the moment. You mentioned the Earn It Act in the US, which is a troubling piece of legislation from that perspective. And that's something we can talk to Andi more about in a bit. But like you said, it is obviously an issue in each of these countries, and the public discourse does differ. But generally, people do not want to see a weakening of privacy standards and secure communications. People understand why strong encryption matters, which is why I think it's so important for us to keep engaging with this forum, where the narrative can be quite well, first of all, it's very closed, but really securitized and focused on a couple of issues without considering the wider framework and ecosystem in which all of these issues play out. You ended on a quite positive note, I have to say, but very cautious as well, saying that people are realizing how important digital security is, but there is concern, there is fear, I guess. It wouldn't be too exaggerated to say, in the current climate because of the pandemic. And we do need to make sure that the powers that governments are taking on in order to address the pandemic do not go completely without safeguards, and that's something that is going to require a lot of work as well. And that, I suppose, is why we're here. So with that, Joe, I want to go over to you now. Your mandate includes the requirement to identify possible obstacles to the promotion and protection of the right to privacy, to identify, exchange, and promote principles and best practices, and to submit those proposals to the Human Rights Council. I'm wondering what you think these 5 countries, obviously represented by very different actors in the Human Rights Council, versus in the Five Eyes discussions, what they've so far said and how that has an impact on privacy, and again, whether or not you think that this is going to change now with the COVID pandemic.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to set a bit of context for this, in the sense that encryption is a subject on which I have been speaking from the very first minute that I became Special Rapporteur on Privacy. As you know, I am required to present 2 reports annually to the UN, one to the Human Rights Council in Geneva in March of every year, and another to the General Assembly in October in New York every year. And I was appointed, as you said, in July 2015, but in March of 2016, I was already making my point and my position on encryption very clear. I consider encryption to be almost as fundamental a right as privacy is, right? I think it's an integral part today, in today's technological world, of the right to privacy. And in fact, 4 years ago or more, I was already pointing out that the correct approach to my mind was that which was being advocated by the Dutch government in their paper of the 4th of January of 2016, where they said quite clearly, listen, we don't think, you know, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but we don't think backdoors is a good idea. We should encourage encryption. And actually, the Ministry of Home Affairs and Ministry of Justice came together to produce what I call a very sensible governmental approach. So when you tell me, what do I think of the Five Eyes? This is what I contrasted with, right? I contrasted with other governments whom the Five Eyes need to persuade in one way or another. I think a very important part of your introduction was when you called it the oldest intelligence cooperation agreement in the world. But we should not forget that there are many, many intelligence cooperation agreements out there, not least of which all the bilateral intelligence agreements that the United States has with several countries. Because the US trades and data and intelligence data with many, many countries around the world. And I think we should remember the extent to which intelligence is currency. And this currency between not only the Five Eyes, but between the Five Eyes and all their major partners around the world, including intelligence gathering partners. And I don't think you can look at human rights law without looking also at the context, the operational context in which it needs to work. Human rights law also needs to work in the context where you have a number of powers, including those involved in the Five Eyes, who exchange intelligence data between themselves, right? And we have to bear a few more operational issues, which are the following. One, the Five Eyes may say something today, and when they say something in 2020, generally, they are prodded along by what I call institutional memory, right? So is it the ministers who are producing much of the thinking? No, never is. It's normally a combination of the permanent members of the intelligence services and law enforcement agencies in their countries in combination with their national security advisors. The institutions remain there. So if you have a chief of staff or head of intelligence who is prodding his minister along and saying, hey, you know, we can't tolerate this level of encryption. We need to get companies to make encryption less of a hurdle to us. They may choose all kinds of nice words, right? Like, what was it that the Americans were using recently, you know, responsible encryption and all this kind of thing. But in reality, I have yet to see a turkey vote for Christmas, and I have yet to see a head of an intelligence service who is extraordinarily delighted that they're going to have tough encryption to crack. And you can understand that. This being said, it's been a very interesting 8 months. And I think that one of the most important things to remember in the discussion about encryption is that it's not static, which is why the initiative that you and colleagues are taking is so important. Encryption is going to be with us as a subject and as a topic to stay. The only thing is it's going to change. So let me just use some of these opening minutes of mine to remind you some of the changes we've seen over the past months since September. Okay, so since September, what have we seen? We've seen the former General Counsel or Special Counsel of the FBI and the Justice Department of the United States come out openly in September of last year saying, you know, I think we should, I think we should make encryption stronger because I'm worried, and in his case, he was worried about the impact that Chinese companies like Huawei could have inside the 5G and other telecoms infrastructures. That's one argument which was given by Jim Bacon in 2019. But since then, we've also had COVID-19, which is part of the subject header in our discussion today. And we have to remember, that, like it or not, most, indeed all the countries in the Five Eyes, and this is one of the difference from the other players, all of them depend on votes to get into power. And we have to think also the extent to which the COVID-19 is going to impact the voting base, right? So let's backtrack news from today. South Korea and its much vaunted apps, right? Today was announcing that it's going to be more privacy friendly in the way it uses the apps. It's not going to name and shame so much. It's not going to give away details of people's itinerary, etc. Why? Because of the backlash it's had over the past 3 days, right? If you look at the changes, so one of the things I can tell you is that I have very regular meetings with the big companies, right? So yesterday, as I had also 6 weeks ago, I had meetings with, my task force, which includes Apple, Facebook, Google, etc., Microsoft, and we're discussing the developments. So the developments in the past 6 weeks on COVID-19 have been incredible in the sense that the German government has very clearly now gone for a more decentralized approach, being even more sensitive to privacy. In the UK, we've had Harriet Harman and other members of the committee Sheetal in the UK Parliament require and request very strongly that more privacy safeguards need to be built into the legislation, whichever way the trial of the NHS contact tracing app on the Isle of Wight goes. So what you're seeing is many mood indicators, right? And those mood indicators will have a huge impact on the way the cookie finally crumbles. So yes, we have a statement from the Five Eyes. My invitation to you and everybody else around the virtual table is think about who wrote it. Think about who wrote most of it. Think about who signed off on it. It was the politicians signing off, but other people were doing most of the writing. Think about how long they've been there in their jobs and how long they're going to be in those jobs. And also think about all the other context, because all the other context is going to mean that when they get to actually take more concrete decisions about encryption, the results could be quite different. So, for example, how are the Five Eyes going to put pressure, if at all, once COVID-19 leads to a new normality, a new normal, when the European Commission remembers that it wanted to do something about encryption? So once again, will the approaches that the European leaders have taken during COVID-19 possibly soften a bit the previously harsher stances we're taking on encryption? Let's remember that until recently, some of the discussion in Europe was not only are we going to tackle encryption at rest, but also encryption in transit, right? So is that the spirit that's going to continue, or is that one of the things that's going to be taken up? I don't wish to take up more time. There's a lot to be said about the subject. I look forward to hearing more from the fellow panelists, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to say more when we come to the Q&A. Thank you, Sheetal.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. And thank you for reminding us that this is not a static discussion, and also for taking us outside of the Five Eyes into the wider context, which is obviously very important, because this is a global issue, and like you mentioned, mood indicators and other the trends and perspectives of other countries also shapes the discussions. And that's really key to remind us. And you also remind ourselves of, and you also mentioned that, and this is something I think we can certainly pick up in the second part of the discussion, which is about what we can do going forward. each of the Five Eyes countries are also democracies accountable to their publics, which leads me on to Andi. Actually, I wanted to ask you, as we've asked the others earlier, about how you think the discussion is playing out around encryption, including in the US, and how you think that's going to impact the Five Eyes discussions, and whether you are as optimistic as Matt in terms of how the public is seeing the issue. So over to you, Andi.
Thank you so much. So I am a senior policy analyst at New America's Open Technology Institute. We're an organization based in Washington, D.C., and we focus on ensuring that everyone has equitable access to an open and secure internet. One of the issues that we have worked on for multiple years is encryption, and is the protection of strong encryption. And so this is something that we're obviously very engaged in, mostly at a US level, but also, this happens around the world, and policies in other countries strongly impact US policy. So we've been very actively engaged in the UK and also in Australia. We don't do grassroots work, unlike open media, but we do engage in coalition work with civil society allies, and we also advocate on these issues with policymakers and with companies. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the trend line in both how we frame the encryption debate and also about government strategies for undermining encryption over the past 6-ish years. So a little bit backward, and obviously most of you will know sort of the issues of how we came into the encryption debate, but I'd really like to highlight sort of where that came from and how we got to where we are. So the 1990s original crypto wars in the US focused on exceptional access, specifically on encouraging companies to have things like 2-tier encryption, or to include devices like a clipper chip in consumer devices. And we as civil society are very happy that that didn't go through, that we won that battle due to engagement from advocates, academics, technologists, and allies in Congress. And so that was sort of the beginning of this debate in the US. Fast forward to 2014, when Apple and Google implemented device encryption by default, focusing on the debate from law enforcement as concerns about going dark or about criminals being beyond the law. So this was sort of a framing of encryption that was something used by terrorists and criminals, and not something that mattered to ordinary people who would just like to have a secure cell phone. And so the event at the time, which so clearly identifies the way that narrative played out, was the terrorist attack in San Bernardino, where the FBI pushed Apple to decrypt a phone belonging to one of the attackers. And so this was, the US government pushing hard against a popular company who makes millions and millions of phones that lots of people own. And Apple really stood up for its customers. And ultimately, the FBI unlocked the phone using third-party software. But that was sort of an example of where the US government thought that the pain point was looking at not, overall legislation, though that's something they've been trying for years, but how this specific company in this specific quite scary situation could use its technology to undermine encryption. And that is a hallmark of attacks on encryption from about 2014 to 2018, focusing on issues of terrorism and criminals, and the desire for exceptional access. So looking to regulate or limit encryption in order to ensure that there is some sort of golden key or key escrow or exceptional access to consumer products. So that was the fight we were having for a while, and civil society very actively engaged, and companies very actively engaged, and spoke out saying, this is something that's very important to us and very important to our customers, regardless of the pressure that they were receiving from law enforcement and from the intelligence community. And I will note that, as the Special Rapporteur mentioned, multiple US law enforcement and intelligence experts, senior people within those organizations, since they left, have spoken out to protect strong encryption, including Jim Baker, who was at the FBI during the FBI v. Apple situation. So, this is something that even those within government who are focusing on the exceptional access argument and saying, we can't have strong encryption if we don't want criminals to flourish, have spoken out saying actually either they've come around or are speaking differently now that they are not professionally engaged in that situation. So fast forward to now, and part of the reason we're having this conversation, the argument raging isn't about terrorism anymore, right? We're still talking about criminality, we're still talking about exceptional access, but the framing is different, and the framing is really concerning to us because, we're not looking for a straight backdoor anymore. I mean, exceptional access is definitely something the government wants, but we're not talking about a golden key to every device. What we're talking about specifically is the pressure, instead of terrorism, is talking about exploitation of children. And both of those are situations that are very concerning, and pressure on companies is something that the government has used as a tool. However, the issue of CSAM, or child sexual abuse material, is really an emotional, concerning issue. And so the pressure on companies from that perspective is something we are very worried about as advocates in this area. And we're very worried about the mechanisms that the government is using to try and pressure those companies. So the trend line from the big threat, the reason we can't have encryption being terrorism, has moved towards the characterization of encryption as a means to facilitate the exchange of child sexual abuse material. And this has gained significant traction in the US, specifically as a measure to pressure internet platforms through fears of liability. So if they can't get a straight encryption backdoor, how can the government get around that with a different argument or a different mechanism? And so right now we are specifically talking about what was mentioned by Matt, the Earn It Act, or the Eliminating Abusive and Rampant Neglect of Internet Technologies Act, which was introduced into the Senate earlier this year. And this is what we would call a domestic backdoor to a backdoor. It doesn't mention encryption, though we have heard from government officials that they're specifically targeting encryption. But the commission that it creates require best practices set up by the commission would require companies to be able to intercept sexual abuse material going back and forth on their platform, and if they can't, threaten them with revoking the immunity they have with threatening liability under the Section 230 Act in the US, which is something that has protected internet companies from liability in many cases. And so, although this is a different way of framing the pressure on companies, not that you are bad people and supporting terrorists, but child sexual exploitation is really a space where a lot of people who are very pro encryption are hesitant to engage on that issue and think of maybe there's some other way we could have exceptional access. And so the trend line is really concerning because this is sort of a different debate that we're having now, and we're trying to find encryption is just as important. And especially we're noting during COVID, one of the issues that advocates have struggled with over the past 7 years has been, regular people who say they don't have anything to hide or they don't talk about anything important over the internet. And so don't really worry if the government has access to their communications. The challenge is now that is the only mechanism of communication that they have. And so, there really isn't an option. The pressure that the government has put on companies like Facebook to stop its practices or its plans to implement end-to-end encrypted messenger means that the government is focusing on companies that support the communications of billions of people and using public pressure to say, what you're doing is bad. And this has been a collaborative effort coming from the US, the UK, and Australia specifically, noting in October of last year, the open letter that they published to Facebook saying, please do not go forward with your process for securing communications because of CSAM. And so this is an effort among the Five Eyes, but those three countries are extremely powerful in this debate, saying, we're collaborating and this is the new way, this is the new trend for how we're going to frame this issue. And that's really concerning. And I don't feel super optimistic, especially given the government we currently have in the US.
Okay, Andi, thank you for that. that was a really useful overview as well. You went further back than I did in my intro to the 90s, and I think made clear also the point that Joe Cannataci was sharing with us earlier about this is not a static debate. But some of what you mentioned, which showed us how the debate has changed a bit, I think also made clear that in many ways it has remained focused on one issue or another, that has securitized the discussion and not allowed really the role of encryption and the increasingly important role of encryption for everyday life to be understood, leading to proposals which you've just mentioned, most recently in the U.S. Earn It Act, which are very concerning, and like you said, for a number of reasons it is. And I'd feel free to share if you've had any resources for attendees in the chat, any further reading they might be able to do on that. So we've had quite a good overview, I think, of what the situation is. It's clearly one that is still very much live, not static, but we're also dealing with a context, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has made the issue of encryption ever more important, ever more vital for people's lives. And yet the discussion around powers that government should have, increased surveillance powers, also something which means that the public position could shift on those issues, and public scrutiny for these really important matters could shift. So I think that's a really interesting topic to discuss, and I think we have a lot to think about. And I'd encourage you to keep jumping in with your questions. What we have here in the questions already that we've received relate to the technological developments in quantum computing capability and R&D capabilities of Five Eyes countries, and a question around whether or not that's giving people a false sense of security when it comes to their use of encryption. Is end-to-end encryption even enough anymore? That's one question. And there's a question here about the tech sector and the fact that a lot of advocacy is focused on governments, but the tech sector also plays a role in surveillance, sometimes called surveillance capitalism. And we have a question here directly for you, Andi, on what alternative mechanisms would you recommend to identify child sexual abuse material and the people behind it? So there's a few questions there. I'm going to, as I've just read those out, just open the floor to the panelists to ask if you'd like to jump in on any of those. There's an interesting one there. We hear a lot about whether quantum computing is going to destroy encryption anyway, at least pose a real challenge to it, but a lot of disagreement about how long that will take. And so I suppose that's very much an open question. Let me leave it open to you now. Do feel free to jump in if you'd like to take on any of those.
I could comment briefly on a couple of those, although
Sure.
I think that my answer on the quantum question, certainly from our perspective, is we don't know where that's at. My understanding from what I've read is we're still some years out from that being a reality. But obviously that would be a huge game changer for all encryption. We would lose access to most of the encryption technologies we currently rely on. So I guess we'll see. In terms of the question of government versus the tech sector, I think they're both suitable targets for advocacy. And it really depends on what your concern is and what you're trying to change. So for government, obviously, they're setting the rules of the game, which is why we tend to prioritize them. They're able to influence the tech sector, and the tech sector is somewhat less able to influence the government. Whereas for the tech sector, it's really more about influencing practice. And but we do campaigns aimed at both.
I'm happy to go first with the direct question about access to child sexual abuse material. So one of the ways that we actually, in the 1990s, and I say we as in not me, we as in advocacy, because in the 1990s, I was definitely not having these conversations. I was in elementary school. But I think one of the impactful arguments, at least at the US level, was that there is always better crypto, right? And there's a story of experts bringing technological tools to Congress and saying, hey, here is the stuff you can buy from Russia, and here's the stuff you can buy internationally, and people are always going to have this. And a lot of the encryption that was available in the early 90s, especially, was things like PGP that individuals implemented themselves. Not so much, we didn't have social media, we didn't have the types of platforms that are now implementing encryption. And so I think from the surveillance capitalism perspective, one of the things that is really important is well-implemented both end-to-end encryption, end-to-end encrypted communication, and device encryption also protect your information from companies, right? So your information is protected from government intervention, but also Apple can't read your communications, right? Or Google cannot read your communications. I mean, it depends on what tech we're talking about at what company, but Facebook would be implementing technology, or WhatsApp has, that means that the government can't read, but they also can't. And so, obviously there's a mistrust of companies, and there's an understanding that, they want to make money off you and your exchange of information. But surveillance capitalism is a serious problem, but everyone benefits from implementation of strong encryption. And so I would much prefer that Apple also be unable to read my phone, right? And that is sort of where we exist right now. On CSAM specifically, obviously there has been a lot of criticism of the idea that encrypted communications might mean that the tips, especially that Facebook gives to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, might dry up. And as we had the similar argument in the early 90s, a lot of exploitation of children and a lot of exchange of material isn't happening on Facebook Messenger, right? It isn't happening even on Messenger. It might be happening in Facebook groups. It might be happening where people post messages on walls. But ultimately, there's also the dark web. There's also groups where things are exchanged. And so this mechanism that mostly innocent regular people use to communicate is not necessarily the mechanism where the vast majority of CSAM exchange happens. And so I'm not an expert on exactly the ways that companies might be able to implement tools to bypass this, because we don't know exactly how a lot of these communications protocols work. But I think targeting service that is used by 2 billion people, that isn't where the most criminal activity is happening. Just like years ago, like phones that individuals have communication on is not where the vast majority of criminals are interacting. So I think it's really a false choice, especially because when you hear from experts in the US testifying who work on issues of child sexual abuse, most of them are saying they don't have enough money and they don't have enough tech expertise to even investigate the tips they already have. So it's a lack of access to capacity, not necessarily a lack of access to tips.
Thanks, Andi, for coming in on that question. So we have had a few questions in the chat, and I think your response really captured, Andi, is just how disproportionate or sort of one-sided this discussion can often be. And I think that we've heard a lot about how the issue changes, or it kind of comes back and goes back and forth, but it remains an issue that it continues to be so one-sided, and the proposal so disproportionate, and not considering, like you said, that there are billions of users. And I think that is something that is really hard or challenging to tackle when it comes to, of course, the Five Eyes in a forum which is so closed and limited to the discussions amongst interior ministers, etc., and on really emotional topics like you just mentioned. So that's a challenge that we're going to come on to in the second part. Before we do, I wanted to make sure that Joe, if you had anything to add on some of those questions, or just generally reflecting on what the other panelists have said before we move on to segment 2.
Well, I won't be long but there's a lot to react to there. I think that the most important thing is that they remind us of the complexity of the situation, right? As I was saying before, the Five Eyes don't exist in a vacuum, and they will never exist in the vacuum. So firstly, the Five Eyes themselves internally are not static. The politicians come and go, and different positions come with the politicians. Secondly, there's the internal politics within the Five Eyes. If you were to ask me the question, do you know of declarations by the Five Eyes which not all governments really agreed with, but they let through anyway, just not to piss off one of the other members? The answer is yes. I'm not going to tell you which ones they are, but that's the way the Five Eyes works too. You know, there's politics between the more senior partners and the more junior partners. So what they say, I always take with a pinch of political salt. But then they're also operating not in a vacuum outside the English-speaking world, right? There's a lot going on over there. So I think that when we see the way that things will move in the different states and the relations with important blocs like the EU, but also there will be individual countries like Israel and India, etc., with whom the Fives would be keen to maintain good relations. You would need to see what's going to happen inside the overall privacy strategy. And the overall privacy strategy would include the extent to which citizens in democracies will accept that surveillance of any form can take place without proper oversight. So one of the things that I would suggest is that you cannot divorce this discussion from the discussion of the development of oversight of surveillance internationally, but also inside the Five Eyes. So Canada has been reforming its laws. The UK has reformed its laws by 2016, and we've seen some interesting progress there. The Australians have reformed their laws in the wrong direction, and the United States has just given us an example of how the law should not be by President Trump firing the Inspector General of Intelligence. Now, these things, the safeguards which exist for the oversight of intelligence and surveillance, will be woven into the wider debate on privacy, COVID-19, and encryption. Because unless the problems in US law are fixed, and I have in mind Section 33 of that particular law, which provides for the Inspector General of Intelligence, unless you have all these details which are sorted out, you cannot properly speak about encryption alone. You need to make sure that you get the discussion on encryption properly positioned inside the ecosystems of surveillance and safeguards that you have on surveillance. Encryption is only one small part of a much larger argument, although it's an important one. Thank you, Sheetal.
Hopefully you can still hear me. Thank you so much, Joe. That was, again, a really important reminder that this is all part of a bigger discussion and a larger landscape in which this discussion is playing out on encryption, namely with surveillance legislation and appropriate necessary safeguards and oversight which government is subject to, privacy. And that's why we're discussing like I said, this issue, relating it to the COVID pandemic and looking forward as well, wondering whether or not the discussion within the Five Eyes will shift, because the narrative so far, as you reminded us, Andi, has continued down a path which, while it's shifted a little bit, has continued to be very narrow, and troubling, and so that, I suppose, is something that we need to keep in mind as we go to the second part of this discussion, which I'm really keen to get into, actually. And I think you've set us up really nicely for that by reminding us of the wider context. And reminding us that things shift and that we're talking about democracies here. We're talking about countries where the public mood can shift. And so, Joe, I'm actually going to come back to you, give you a tiny break there, but I'm going to come back to you because as we move into this discussion, based on what we've already discussed about how the Five Eyes operates in a wider, broader landscape, we've talked about how they're each democracies, about the trends so far. What can we actually do? What would your advice be, perhaps, as a coalition gets started, to engage with these issues and within this forum in order to shift that narrative that we've seen so far?
Thank you. Well, I don't think I'll surprise anybody by saying that while you should speak about encryption and focus on public awareness, right? I think that you should also make a conscious effort of involving yourselves and contributing to the public awareness on the broader context for it. In other words, all of surveillance, how encryption provides security and an increase of privacy to all citizens, but also when it comes to pointing out weaknesses in the laws, right? Because a weakness in the oversight of surveillance equals a weakness in the oversight of the extent to which encryption is being legitimately or illegitimately broken down, abused, etc. So I would encourage you to look carefully at the wider context. And if there are weaknesses which point to institutional safeguards being weakened, like, for example, if the US would need a law to be strengthened, which would strengthen the position of the Inspector General of Intelligence and not making that person subject to being fired on a presidential whim. That is still part of the discussion on encryption. But also, I would suggest that you organize a broader dialogue to which I would be very happy to contribute also as part of the mandate, right? I was the first person, but others too have mentioned Jim Baker and others. We need to bring those people in order to discuss it, in order to convince our constituents and our publics deliberately chosen as a plural here, to explain succinctly and clearly what the threats to encryption mean as threats to the man in the street, right? And also how they play out in many ways. I would also suggest that you don't make the discussion too Anglo-centric, too Five Eyes centric. Encryption is a very important subject in Brazil, right? WhatsApp has 100 million users in Brazil. It helps power a lot of business, SMEs, as well as private companies and indeed government officials. When a government shuts down WhatsApp because of the refusal to hand over, or indeed the technical impossibility of handing over intercepted communications because of peer-to-peer encryption inside WhatsApp, that has huge consequences outside the United States, outside Europe, etc. So I would also strive to create a regional discussion on encryption. South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, etc. Because I think you're going to find many different perspectives over there, and some which might persuade you to go for one in one direction and another in another direction. There's a lot of debate to be explored, and I think there's a great contribution you can make to a reasoned debate. Let's remember that none of us around the table are advocating some loony approach to life. None of us are saying we don't want security. None of us are saying we don't think intelligence services have a legitimate purpose. Of course they do. All we want them to do is stick to those basic principles in international law, which are, if you're going to have a privacy intrusive measure, it must be necessary and proportionate in a democratic society. Now, if you infringe on encryption, if you try to cut down on encryption, then you are going to have to prove, at least to me, that that measure is necessary and proportionate. I haven't seen any such proposals. I am the kind of person who would support targeted surveillance if you persuade me that the target is, there's reasonable suspicion that that person is a terrorist or a criminal or what have you. And in that case, if you have the means to crack encryption or that person, or put malware on that person's portable devices, yeah, why not? If given the due process, with the right safeguards for the oversight of surveillance in that case, I think that's part of the way forward. On the other hand, a blanket permission to weaken encryption or keep, there are many ways to do so, even through so-called, third-party key and other forms of dilution of encryption. I think that the debate is going to continue to be global, which is why I'm proposing you go global. When a company like whatever it is, Facebook, Google, whoever, is faced with a request from a proposal from the Australian government to put into law to weaken its products, including, the ability, in theory, to force them to back down or dilute encryption. Do you really think that Apple is going to fall over just because the Prime Minister of Australia says, I'm going to invoke this clause in the law? No. Apple is going to, and other companies are going to look at the global market and the extent to which privacy and encryption going hand in hand are part of their competitive advantage. And up to now, we've seen companies like Apple and others who have moved from and become quite vocal about privacy and encryption because it's part of their competitive edge. And I think that we should continue to see that. And I think we should continue to see companies actually fight measures by governments which attempt to get them to dilute encryption. So that at least is part of the silver lining to the cloud we have on the horizon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. And thanks for those suggestions, including the one to organize a broader dialogue. As you mentioned, focusing on public awareness is key, and reflecting on the broader context, the global one, is really important. And you mentioned that you'd be happy to contribute to that discussion. So I'm sure we will be reaching out to you after this to engage on these issues. So we're definitely going to keep that in mind. And as you know, this is a global encryption coalition, which spans all the regions of the world, and we've actually got a range of webinars, some of which already have happened earlier in the day, and those coming up to address this issue in a wide range of contexts. And that's why we're so excited that this coalition will be able to amplify, hopefully, some of those efforts and fill in gaps and contribute to that broader dialogue, which you've just mentioned is so important. So thank you for that. And I'm going to go over to Andi now. One of the things that we've been discussing is the need to engage publics in these issues, and the need to go a bit broader than just the Five Eyes. But I have to say we have been trying, haven't we? as NGOs. I mentioned the letter in 2017, and since then there's been a range of efforts ahead of and after Five Eyes meetings, pushing back against that narrative, which we've been discussing. But we keep seeing that. We keep seeing that same language coming out. So Andi, what do you think we need to do? And what suggestions do you have that we could take forward as a coalition, particularly thinking about that meeting later in the year?
Sure. So I definitely think the role that OTI has played has been strongly working in coalition and convening coalition organizations. And as we've seen, intelligence collaboration between the Five Eyes means that threats to encryption in any one of these countries affects all of them, but also affects countries around the world, because especially a lot of the companies that we're talking about are based in Five Eyes countries. So for us working in America, if the US can't get a backdoor, maybe somebody else can. And given this, OTI has worked internationally on fights in Australia surrounding the Assistance and Access Act, as well as fights in the United Kingdom over GCHQ's recent ghost proposal, which would silently add a law enforcement participant in group chat and suppress the notifications. And so our most effective advocacy, I have a couple lessons just learned over our work that I'd love to share, but our most effective advocacy work has been in coalition with allies. And through this work, we've had a couple lessons learned. So for instance, I'm going to provide some examples. I think the first lesson is that we should know who matters and which voices are most important to have in that coalition. So for example, in our efforts against the Indian government's intermediary guidelines in March of 2019, I think, it was really important to focus on both international civil society organizations with high profiles, domestic Indian organizations, and also technical experts, because they would be the most impactful. Companies would not have been the right members of that coalition and would not have made our efforts stronger. In contrast, our response to the ghost proposal had the most impact publicly and media sort of splash because big tech companies signed on as allies. So the major news outlets want to highlight how Apple, Google, and WhatsApp condemn UK proposal to eavesdrop on encrypted messages. Those participants in that coalition are what made the difference in getting us in the room with experts at GCHQ. So our Five Eyes efforts in Australia, in the UK, in the US have meant that that coalition work has actually gotten us into the room, gotten us to have conversations with the people in charge and have them consult us on the ways, for instance, they're amending the Assistance and Access Act. So working, understanding who matters in that coalition is really important. And that's not just domestic. So I think the second lesson is to sort of have a wide reach, that coalitions can be both broad and also deep. So it's always really interesting to see what organizations actually want to engage on these issues. When you put out the invitation, when you have colleagues spread it to their networks, encryption in a specific case could matter a lot to, say, victims of domestic violence, whereas the same proposal may matter also a lot to payments processing companies. Especially when advocating with Five Eyes countries, the issues matter to organizations also in South America, Asia, a lot of these, especially who don't either have a ton of work on encryption in their own countries that they've been doing, but they'd really like to engage at an international level, or who see their work and their experience as being very much impacted by what happens in the US, UK, Australia, Canada. I think the third lesson is sort of knowing how to engage. So sometimes an official comment process is really valuable. I think we've submitted 6 sets of comments to the Australian Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. And we're really happy that there has been that opportunity as a coalition, because it means that there is an official mechanism to submit our recommendations, where we know that at least someone is going to read them and is interested in what is in them. Whereas for a topic that's been more confrontational, or for a government that we maybe see differently, an open letter has been important. So in the case that I mentioned, where the US, the UK, and Australian Departments of Justice got together to write their open letter to Facebook, we had over 100 organizations around the world who wrote an open letter that came out on the day of the hearing, where representatives from those departments of justice spoke about their concerns about child sexual abuse material. So knowing how to engage and the best way to make an impact has been really important, and bringing those organizations in as well, because we don't do grassroots outreach, but we've very much benefited from organizations like Open Media who've signed on as part of those coalitions and have a different way to engage with a different audience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andi, for that really specific guidance. Building on all your experience, engaging in these efforts on this tricky. I don't think any of us are under any illusion that it's not a trick. It's a tricky issue, particularly when engaging with the public, and when the narrative, like you mentioned, can be so emotional. When it's framed in a certain way. And so one of the things that you mentioned is how important it is to consider who needs to be involved in a coalition, or who needs to be involved in outreach efforts, and how that will affect the message and how it's received. That can include engaging with companies where and when relevant, how important it is to engage with grassroots organizations, and tailoring that message and tailoring the approach as well, how open letters can work sometimes and other times it's a different approach, how important it is to consider timing with that outreach as well. All things we'll certainly be noting, and will be part of the engagement of the Global Encryption Coalition as well. So I'll turn to Matt now. Andi mentioned the importance of grassroots engagement, Matt, and how that's already been essential with engagement around the Five Eyes. Do you have any other lessons learned, perspectives to share that we can build on going ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll speak to, I really appreciate the sort of strategic level insights that Andi was sharing, which I think are all very valid. And I'll speak to some of the sort of tactics differences that she was referring to. I think I want to talk a bit about narrative. So very big picture, what we're going to see this year is the continuance of COVID-19 as a giant sucking engine, just pulling in all the media attention, a lot of the civil society activity. And we desperately need to get ahead of the next Five Eyes meeting, because if we wait until a few weeks before, there's no way anyone's going to pay attention to anything we have to say about it. We need to be speaking with media, other civil society groups from other sectors, and with society at large now, explaining why encryption matters during this pandemic more than ever. It's kind of interesting to reflect on, speaking to both what Joe and Andi have talked about, like what's changed and what hasn't over the years. So in terms of the technical level, as best as I can tell as a non-expert, the conversation hasn't changed at all, and the issues haven't changed at all in the last 25 years around encryption. What has changed and what continues to evolve is the political level and the way in which attacks on encryption get framed, as both have pointed out. And as I think as Andi kind of referred to earlier around the new focus on child abuse, it's really a bit of a shame game right now. So it is obviously very shameful to appear to be uncaring or inactive in the face of child abuse online or of terrorist attacks. We all care about preventing both of those things, and it's very difficult to appear to be getting in the way of doing so. But I don't think the shame game goes in only one direction. It is also deeply shameful for governments to create the conditions to handle their citizens' data, or to hand their citizens' data over to thieves, to stalkers, and to hostile governments. It's shameful to tell activists working under autocratic governments that democratic governments will do nothing to protect them and their online communications from those governments. And really, I mean, if you think that backdoor keys can be given only to Five Eyes countries and their democratic allies, I've got a bridge to sell to you, like that's not going to happen. I think the continued sort of pragmatic and technical analysis of proposals and laws is very important. It can feel like a tired record trotting out the same points about what isn't technically feasible and tailoring it to different platforms and proposals. I know I certainly get tired of doing it. But I do hear from my sort of more policy-oriented colleagues that having new material on this front is really important ammunition for bureaucrats within these governments who agree with us, and they need to have the arguments on hand to provide to their colleagues to keep fighting that internal battle. So it's not the work that we do, but I do think there's a huge role for it. I think, though, that we need to look quite a bit beyond that. As Joe pointed out, a huge trend in recent years has been seeing more and more businesses adopting end-to-end encryption, despite knowing that governments are pushing back against it, which is really interesting to me. I think they're doing this because their users want it, and they're doing this because their corporate customers want it and see the business benefits as well. And we really need to be getting out of just our activist circles and just the circles of us and big tech like Google, Facebook, and Apple, and reaching out to like all the smaller industries that are building their business model based off strong encryption and getting them in the room, getting them lending their voice to our coalitions. And frankly, I think we need to be taking our gloves off a little bit and be more vocal in shaming the proponents of weakening encryption back. I think Joe talked about having the rational debate, and we do need to have the rational debate. But if we're only making the technical feasibility and business argument, we're going to lose. Try being the person out there right now who's talking about purely economic reasons for reopening the economy during COVID-19. It's not a good space to be. You're going to lose the emotional fight. So I think for the public, we need to be very graphic in presenting what the threat of breaking encryption and poses to their rights, to their financial security, to their privacy, and really double down on making those who want to break encryption villains who are enabling thieves and autocrats and not protectors of children as they want to appear. I was glad to hear from both Andi and Joe that they really saw the national level being critical. I think for us at a grassroots level, we see that as being the space that we're most able to really target and pressure politicians. It's where the cross-governmental security establishment of the Five Eyes has the least sway. And so we think it's very important. I do think that's maybe counterintuitively a really good reason to think this global coalition is valuable and important, because this can be a space in which we sort out our talking points, help strengthen each other's analysis of new policies in tech, and then we each take it home and keep building the really effective grassroots homegrown campaigns. I can tell you Open Media has tried running a global encryption campaign in 5 countries at once, and it is very difficult to do well. Even when you pull it off, it's almost impossible to get your campaigns equally strong in each country when you're working from just one organizational headquarters. So I see huge potential here for us working together. And I also wanted to say it was interesting to hear Joe talk about the Dutch example of speaking out for good encryption policy. And I would love to hear from the panelists and from the audience other countries they think that would be good allies for us in pressuring the Five Eyes and trying to break apart their current consensus. I think that Canada's weakening in its defense. The US has future stance is uncertain, so we need that outside pressure. And I'm really I take the Huawei the disagreement between the Five Eyes about how to take that on as a sign that they have pretty different online threat models. They're not united on everything, and if we keep the pressure up, we can really prize the kind of consensus apart.
Thanks, Matt. So much there to go with. I was taking some notes, and I know that we're going to, luckily, be able to continue this conversation because the coalition just launched today, and there is a lot of work to do and a lot to do together, as you said. So we are coming to the last 10 minutes of our webinar, and I will go to each of the panelists for closing. And I'm going to go to you. First, Joe, and I wonder if you have any answers to Matt's question there at the end about other countries, other good examples apart from the Netherlands, and good narratives perhaps that we've heard that we can use as part of this broader dialogue, this attempt to engage more on this issue. If you can speak to that and anything else that's been brought up, that would be great. So over to you, Joe.
Okay, well, what I will do is I won't give you the names now, not because they're a secret, but because they keep on changing. So what I'll do is, as we go towards July and the middle of July, by which time I will have prepared the first draft of my October 2020 report of the General Assembly in New York, in which I will be presenting not only the context of surveillance, but also a kind of State of the Union report on what everybody is doing about COVID-19. I think that then I will have some more countries to talk to you about. But immediately, right? Once you can get their attention, because remember, at this moment in time, COVID-19 is such a major distraction that I know of several countries, including the European countries, which were previously talking about encryption and we're going to dilute encryption, and now it's very much on the back burner. That back burner hasn't been switched off yet. So what I think we need to do is we also have to look at regional champions, right? You have to find yourself a regional champion in South America, right? but over there, you have great sensitivity about military dictatorships and abuse of power. So the discussion on encryption and dilution of encryption will strike quite a different note there, as in other parts of the world. You will find a different approach in Africa, and in sub-Saharan Africa, it will be different to the MENA countries, right? To the MENA countries, I'm sorry, to Middle East and North African countries. But I'm going to give it a think, and I will come back to you with some suggestions on people who could be either regional champions, countries which could be regional champions, or other ideas as how to bring people together at the right time and in the right place. Could I conclude my intervention here by reminding you all that our job is very much like that of a stand-up comedian, right? We have to get the timing absolutely right. You get the timing wrong, the joke falls flat on its face. You get the timing wrong, and you're talking to the wrong politicians or the right policymakers at the wrong time, it's useless. So my advice would be, remember that being successful in keeping encryption strong and making it stronger, also in the service of fundamental human rights, is also about saying the right thing to the right people at the right time in the right way. And I would be very happy to continue to discuss the best way of doing that throughout the rest of my mandate and indeed beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks for that, that invitation to continue this discussion with you. As I said earlier, I think there's a lot more to discuss, and of course, as we look to the Five Eyes annual meeting later this year, as you said, Matt, we need to get ahead, and we need to be speaking to all those actors to try and do this really vital job of shifting that very narrow and arguably completely inaccurate narrative that has so far shaped the discussions within this forum, and really move it in a different direction. So the pandemic creates a whole different context for that, and you've given us, I think all the panelists have given us some really great ideas for how we can do that, and how we can shift that narrative. So Andi, before we close, I'm going to come over to you. Do you have any reflections on what's been said by your fellow panelists on what we need to do, and some of those points that Matt was making and Joe was making just now?
Thanks. I did want to say thank you so much for organizing this coalition and for inviting OTI to be a founding member. I think that we have worked through coalition regularly on our encryption advocacy, and it's so important. So one of the sort of final points I wanted to bring up was first about finding champions within civil society organizations, but also within companies and governments. There are people to whom this really matters and can help both get voices heard and also guide us on how we can best speak to those organizations. I saw one of the comments made that we didn't get to in the Q&A was, did we sense government actors understood the scope of their reliance on encryption? And we've found strong allies on encryption issues within national security aspects of government, within critical infrastructure, because those groups really understand how crucial encryption is to their government in a way that maybe law enforcement doesn't have that perspective. So finding champions within the organizations you're talking to is absolutely key, and they do exist. They exist everywhere. You just need to find the right person who can help you get your voice to the right place or frame the issue correctly. I think the second is that I do agree with others that the technical debate is the same one that we've been having in past decades, that breaking encryption, there is no secure key escrow, there is no secure golden key. I've got the bridge to sell you. It isn't possible that the Five Eyes countries have access and nobody else does. But I think the impact of encryption is just exponentially larger, both because of how deeply technology is embedded in our lives. It's very hard to exist without a smartphone as a professional. Smartphones are extremely common in the developing world, and people rely deeply on WhatsApp to communicate, both with their families and for professional reasons, and also in cases where they may be under threat from more repressive governments. So it is so deeply embedded. We don't have choices whether or not to engage with this technology anymore. It's just part of our lives. And as we've said, in the time of COVID, there is no in-person option, right? Your only option is technological engagement. So the embeddedness of the tech, I think, is really important into convincing people, this really actually affects you. This just doesn't affect only marginalized groups. I think the third thing is sort of finding out how to talk to people. Grassroots organizations and the groups that do grassroots is just so important, and not something we do, but ways to rely on infographics, ways to rely on communication, ways to rely on campaigns. They talk to regular people, and we try and find ways to talk to policymakers. And it's really about thinking, what is the most effective argument, which might not be the most effective argument I think is, but could be the best effective argument for a different target of people. And I think the last thing is sort of looking for pain points. There are issues that really matter that could make the difference in convincing, say, a company to implement encryption. It might be, this is so economically beneficial to you. For a government, this might be, you are under threat from China. Where those pain points are different for different audiences, and coalitions are so important in helping find those, because they range around the world and they range with different targets. And so I think the benefit of coalitions is important, and the benefit of allies is really important. And I very much appreciate the opportunity. ISOC has been an amazing partner in finding connections in different countries that we might not have access to. And so the fact that this is just very formalized now is something that's so great for everyone who cares about these issues.
Thank you, Andi. This 90 minutes has gone by so quickly, and it falls on me to try and summarize where we've come to before letting you all go. And what I think I'm going to do is just pick up on a few points, and this in no way covers everything, because it's very hard to do that. But one thing we've all discussed and agreed on is that this discussion is part of a much wider landscape. But we're talking about bigger issues here, of course, situating this within the landscape of surveillance legislation, of other threats and challenges to privacy. And it's a global issue which affects individuals, and that's something we need to really keep honing in on. And we need to not treat organizations and governments as monoliths, and find champions regionally, but also within organizations. That's really key, and that's something that a coalition can help with. And we kept touching on this point that things are shifting. Things have shifted in the past, and they will continue to shift. No, I think it's very much the case now with the pandemic that we're facing, that things are shifting. We don't know exactly how that's going to shape out, but it is an opportunity to shape the narrative around encryption differently, particularly as we become so much more reliant on digital technologies. And there's so many different audiences at play. Joe, you talked about how we need to act like stand-up comedians on this very serious issue, of course, and keep timing in mind, and keep lots of, the audience in mind, and make sure that we are as targeted and strategic as ever. And one of the points that I think you're all making is how we need to make this party even bigger, the encryption party, the pro-encryption party. We need to work together, get out there, more activists, more big tech, reach out to smaller industries as well. And I'm happy to say, that is exactly what we're doing with the coalition. And so that, I think, is a good point to end on. We invite you to check out the coalition website at globalencryption.org, to click on that link right at the top, join the coalition, and ask about joining the coalition there. because this is obviously an issue, and the Five Eyes is just one space, but a very important space that we'll continue to coordinate around and do work around at this really, really important time. So thank you to the panelists, thank you to you for joining, and thank you also to the staff for who have been behind the scenes this whole time, fielding questions, making sure this has happened, technical issues were sorted, and that we could all be part of this global conversation. Looking forward to continuing that with you. Take care and speak to you all soon.